I'm just testing over on YouTube to make sure that things are streaming here. Hold on 1 second. There we go. Everyone's being so polite and well-behaved. Whatever that means. All right. I just want to make sure the sound is coming through for everybody out there in YouTube land.
Hi, Teresa.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay? Yay.
All right.
I'm excited to see you.
I'm excited to see this really quiet group of people get into a rousing conversation here. I'm just waiting for the sound to come through on YouTube. I want to make sure that it's working. Yep. All right, we're good. Well, I'll get us started here, and I want to thank everybody again for being here and being a part of this conversation, and looking forward to having this conversation. It's kind of inspired by this new book that Christena has written that's coming out, Disunity in Christ, Uncovering the Hidden Forces That Keep Us Apart. And but before we launch into that conversation and introduce everybody who's on the chat tonight, just want to talk about, we've had a number of these open conversations. There's a small group of us who are on the video chat, and then there's a larger group of folks that are out there watching live via YouTube, interacting in the comments there, and we'll hopefully be bringing in questions, comments from those folks as the hour goes on. And but there's a few agreements that we've tried to practice in these open conversations, and I just want to go over those. Holly, I don't think you have them in front of you, do you? Probably not. I'll just go over them here real briefly. So this is an experiment. We're using some new technology. It doesn't always work. Things, people have to drop off. Sound gets glitchy or whatever. So please be patient with each other and with us as we're doing this. We want to acknowledge there are limitations to this process of conversation, and we ask everyone to participate from a place of grace and love, to practice nonviolent communication, and to practice step up and step back. We want everyone who's on here to have an opportunity to say, speak, and give others the opportunity to share what's on their hearts and minds as well. Try not to step on each other, although that might be difficult if there's audio lag or whatever, but try not to interrupt each other and just leave space for everybody to give their perspective. So can we all agree to do that tonight?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. I want to ask Teresa, if you would, just to start us, in the spirit of grace and peace, if you could, to start us with just some contemplative prayer for a few moments before we get started.
Absolutely. So what I like to do in sort of opening in a place of contemplative mind and body and spirit is just take a moment, if we can, with our eyes gently closed, It sort of allows us to bring a focus on the inner presence of God in us. It allows us to pull ourselves out of the white noise of the external world, bringing our attention in on the individual movement of breath in and out of our bodies, that absolute memory and signal of life and of grace moving in and out of us in every individual moment. And creating some space in that breath, slowing down and expanding the inhales, slowing down and expanding the exhales. Imagine breathing in the energy, the grace, and the Spirit of God with every in-breath. And imagine releasing and letting go of anything we don't want to hold on to or carry into conversation with every out-breath. Creating space inside ourselves for that inner voice, that inner grace of God to be wholly with us in our words, in our thoughts, in our presence in each moment in this dialogue with each other, allowing us to remember that grace in us and honor that grace and Holy Spirit in all that we meet in this world, every person, every living, breathing being, everything down to the earth, beneath the floor, beneath our feet, to the sky above our heads, and embracing that whole understanding of God in every particle of everything around us, inside of us, and moving ever present in the breath that flows in and out, both in contemplation, in dialogue, in action, and holding the memory of that inner presence, carrying that with us into our conversation. We ask God to make that space in place in our mind and our hearts and our spirits, to open and welcome His voice in this dialogue, and each and every person partaking in the dialogue with us. In His name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Teresa. We would just want to take a few moments now to go and let each person here who's on the video chat just briefly introduce themselves. And Teresa, why don't you start?
Sure. I am Teresa Pasquale. I'm a contemplative practice teacher by day, and I guess infused in everything I do, I'm also a trauma therapist. One of the areas I work in, difficulty and difference, is around healing and finding space and place for people to find healing rituals, dialogue, experience, and ways in which they can find those places, heal inside, let those places inside themselves heal, so that they can also go out and serve others as healed people, rather than trying to do so in our own brokenness, which can often happen.
I'll go next. My name is Steve Knight, and I am with Sogo Media, a new kind of Christian television network on YouTube, host of these open conversations, and a lot of great video content. Would love everybody to like the Sogo Media Facebook page and get updates about great religion and spirituality videos each and every day. And I wear a bunch of other hats, but that'll suffice for tonight.
I can go next. I'm Holly Roach. Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yep.
Great. And I am calling you from the road. I'm currently in Sonoma, California, and I'm an activist and a cultural organizer. Psyched to be here.
I'm Emily Rice. I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon, where I'm a local activist and in various ways, but in particular, racial justice and gender justice are areas where I'm very passionate.
I'm Bruce Reyes-Chow. I'm in San Francisco, California, Presbyterian pastor for many years, writer and speaker about a lot of different things, technology and race and all kinds of stuff.
Hey, Christina, we can't hear you. Let's see. There you go. Audio difficulties. Still.
Is that better?
There we go. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, cool. I'm Christina. I live in Minneapolis. I am a social psychologist. I am a reconciliation aficionado and activist. I coach a lot of pastors and leaders on issues of reconciliation in the church.
Fantastic.
And I'm happy to be here.
Yay! Yay! Well, we were hoping to have Christina on an earlier open conversation, and it didn't work out. And so, you know, we just said we want to have you back at another time. And so here we are.
Thank you.
And yeah, it's glad to have you here, and really grateful to have had the opportunity to meet you earlier this year at the Inhabit conference and learn about the work that you're doing. And this question, the much larger, you know, conversation of unity in the church and why it's so difficult and why there are so many denominations, why there are so many divisions. To get us kicked off, Christina, could you just, you know, give us a little bit of a summary of your work? I know, yeah, your eyes are getting big, like you want me to distill it all down into, you know, the short Reader's Digest version. But yeah, just introduce us to your work and how you approach this and what you've learned and what you're talking about in this book.
Sure. Okay. Well, this book was born out of the 2008 presidential election. So even though a lot of my work looks at least a lot of the work that I do on my blog looks at racial disunity, the book's actually about probably addresses more broadly cultural and ideological disunity, including political differences, theological differences, that kind of stuff. It would take a book to explain what I think, and then some. But I do focus on the underlying psychological processes that contribute to divisions in the church. We often think that other people are on the other side of our cultural line because there's something wrong with them, or because they are not as Christian as we are, or because their perspective is flawed in some significant way. And so in my book, I just talk a little bit about the natural processes that lead us to erect divisions, even when they shouldn't exist, or when the divisions certainly shouldn't be as prominent. And then I also talk about some of the more sinister underlying processes as well, like self-esteem and identity, and how they play a role in the way that we form groups in the church. That's like a really broad introduction.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. Now, there's a great group of people on here, so I imagine everyone has things that they would have to say about this topic, and or questions for Christina about the work that she's doing. So I'm just going to step back and let the rest of you jump in.
Okay, I'll say a little more. Would that be helpful? So, and a couple of my chapters in my book look specifically at how we use our group memberships to boost our self-esteem and to wage war against others. And so I talk a little bit about how we social psychologists understand group membership as something that really informs our sense of self. And so to the extent that I'm a part of a group, I want to feel good about that group because that group membership makes me feel good. If I feel good about my group, then I feel good about myself. And so we can engage in pretty subtle but powerful ways of denigrating other groups in order to feel good about our group. And that's one thing that can contribute to divisions.
Chrissy, I'll just ask you a random question then about race. This is Bruce.
Sure.
So the idea now that, I think there are some, white folks in the world, in the United States now that would say, it's almost easier to be black or brown now in the United States, and as privilege is shifting and all those kinds of things. How do you respond to somebody that says, well, if we would just either stop talking about all this stuff, we'd be fine, or gosh, you're going to talk about race again, it really is over, and if things are better for you all now, kind of thing. How do you engage that question that always seems to come up?
So I usually just point to the statistics and show that, well, if race isn't really an issue anymore, and if it's something that would be better forgotten, then why does it seem like there are all these disparities based on racial lines that are most accounted for by differences in race? So I usually start there and encourage people to think about like the massive income disparities and wealth disparities and educational attainment disparities, and then say, well, how do you explain these if race doesn't matter anymore? And that usually jumpstarts the conversation for me. If that person's a person of Christ too, then, a follower of Christ, then you can appeal to their sense of identity in the body of Christ. I don't know. How have you responded to those questions, Bruce?
I think somewhat the statistics, but I do think part of me just feels if somebody's coming at that, then there's a lot more work to be done, and so I was just curious about how you would do that, because I do very similar. We'll talk about, well, let's look at the bigger picture. Maybe you felt that way, and I do think it's important to acknowledge how folks are feeling, whether or not it's backed up by any kind of fact at all. And I don't think it drives policy or drives any of that. But there's something about acknowledging that folks are struggling, and then kind of go into trying to have some conversations a little more rational. But I don't know. I think that is a big question right now for a lot of folks who are struggling in so many ways and are looking at a reason why, and these difficult places are easy scapegoats, kind of thing.
Yeah, I feel like that question usually comes out of a bit of defensiveness. So it's like an emotionally laden question, and so to respond with just rational data isn't always helpful. Although sometimes it's helpful to drop people out of the emotional experience and look a little bit more objectively too, and so that can be helpful. I found. Yeah.
One of the things that I notice a lot is they're often is a tendency to overlook or minimize, I guess, the concerns that minority folks, in particular racial or gender folks, bring up in the context of wanting to present kind of a unified front. Christena, do you look at all about how this manifests itself, and maybe some ways that groups who are trying to protect that group identity can do a better job at recognizing where there are divisions, even if they don't want to see them there?
Yeah, you know, we have a really, really hard time with people who we think are part of our group, who toe the party line for the most part, but sort of sway off the propaganda, or, you know, off the agreed upon stance in an important way. And we call them black sheep in social psychology. And we actually have kind of a special hatred for them because they blur the lines between us and them. And so it's not helpful if I think of myself as a Republican. I want to distinguish myself from Democrats, and one way I can do that is by saying, well, I'm pro-life. And so if I run across a pro-choice Republican, then I don't like them because they blur the lines between me and Democrats, and that's uncomfortable for me cognitively and emotionally. And so there's certainly I've certainly looked at a lot of that research and even done some studies on my own with that. And really, I think the only way to get around that is to think about like kind of a common identity, and it's really hard to do that. To sort of think more broadly, because we tend to have the like draw the line in the stand perspective, especially when you're the minority group and you're sort of in like a bunker situation where it's us against the world. And so kind of acknowledging those defense mechanisms that are already up, and the ways that we create very distinct categories of who's part of us and who's not part of us. And having conversations about what it would look like to have people in the group who aren't exactly like us but are moving in the same direction. So kind of moving from like a centered, a bounded set to a centered set way of even thinking about group memberships along ethnic lines or along, you know, reconciliation lines.
Christena, I was curious in terms of in the social constructs, when you're working with a community to kind of break through the barrier or deconstruct some of that identity and that sort of group cultural personhood, that the pieces of those identity. What kind of anything in particular that you utilize sort of as a technique for people to think outside, besides the sameness piece, but just to kind of help them maybe deconstruct some of that identity that they hold to so fast but may not necessarily see?
Not necessarily
see in themselves. I mean, not see that they're sort of, they've enculturated to whatever those lines are, you know, when they don't even see what they're sitting inside of in terms of
so I'm not sure, I'm having a hard time hearing you, but are you asking how to help people understand that they have a culture, or a group identity? Is that what you mean?
Because sometimes something that I've recognized is that it's sort of something that people do without thinking oftentimes, and specifically in church culture it can happen, and whether it's the church culture versus the outside, or whether it's pieces of the church culture fragmenting off, that people don't even see that those divisions are even there to kind of open that door for them to see it.
Yeah. You know, I usually just pick up on those divisions pretty quickly, and I pick up on like a silly one that people don't take as seriously, and that helps them see the more serious ones. So I was actually speaking to a group in, they were from like the Seattle area, and within literally like a half hour of being with this group, it became really clear to me that there were like Huskies fans and Cougars fans. And so I just brought that up as like, look at this division right here in your group. Like there are basically, like everyone boils down to two people who went to Washington State or people who went to University of Washington. And they could laugh about it, and they could say, oh yeah, we didn't notice that, but we have really erected that division in this group, and that's one that's not very sinister. But once you can point out some of those, then people start to think, oh wait, and then there are these other ones that are much more, I think, impactful, like political differences or theological differences or racial differences. And so I found that to be pretty helpful and easy to do. But I think people have a harder time understanding their culture than necessarily their group identity. You know, like once you start talking about identity, most people can say, like, yes, I do identify as, you know, middle class or something, although I think people have a harder time, I think whites have a harder time identifying as white, but a lot of the other, I think, social identities, you could talk about sororities and fraternities in college, you know, lots of like just little examples, sports teams, and I think they realize they have a stake in it pretty quickly, so, yeah. I think.
So I have a question. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yep.
So in a community that prides itself in being kind of more postmodern, whereas, you know, prides itself in not dividing itself along ideological lines, where do you see those divisions happen?
Yeah,
And,
that's
yeah. Run with that.
okay. I appreciate that question. You know, I actually think it's a little bit easier to work with groups that are less postmodern in that respect, because divisions are easily pointed out in within modern groups or within groups that are still heavily influenced by modernism, but modernity. And the postmodern groups, I think, can be a little bit more blind to the camps that they fall into, because there's so much language surrounding being open and being inclusive. And so I think even within postmodernity, there are these lines, right? For example, being inclusive. But the way that we're defining inclusive, or they're defining inclusive, can be a very distinct identifying group right there. And so I have found that it's a little bit trickier to talk about these issues within those groups. I'm not sure if anyone else would agree with that, though.
I would say so. I mean, that kind of matches what my experience has been. I think, I guess from part of my experience, there could be, you know, just this expectation or sense of individualism that seems heightened within certain strands of Christianity, and in particular postmodern folks that are really focused on that. So I think that is definitely a challenge when folks really are invested in this idea of individualism.
Or when there's a value for inclusivity, but there's a discrepancy between the value and what's actually happening. I think it's hard for people to distinguish that, because they say, but this is something, our intentions are to be inclusive, but if you look at the actual outcomes, there's a discrepancy, and I think that can be really confusing. Whereas with a lot of modern groups, the intention is to be a bounded set, and so when you talk about that and challenge them on that, then there's less confusion, because there's more consistency between the ideology and the practice or the behavior.
Christina, I have kind of a different question when it comes to this, and I'll make it really specifically, I guess, and there's broader ways of looking at it, but I'll approach it this way. You know, there was this survey that came out at the beginning of August that talked about how Christianity in North America is becoming more progressive. that the millennial generation, by and large, is more progressive socially, theologically, politically, etc. But the big question mark that the analysts, the people looking at that research, were asking is, what can all of these progressive people ever really come together to form any sort of positive movement? And it's sort of every article that I read by every sort of commentator said, yeah, no, it's not going to happen. Like, these progressive people, they just don't, they're not joiners, or they don't work together. Is there, in your research, like, advice or for folks who are movement people who want to see people come together to make a positive difference in the world? What would you say, or what would you point to?
Yeah, I mean, it's I hadn't read that study. It sounds really pessimistic, but sure. I mean, I think, anytime there's a superordinate goal, so anytime there's a goal that a lot of people buy into, and it requires that lots of people contribute to it in order to be successful. There are so many important ways that group divisions break down in that context of pursuing the goal. And so I think if a group wanted to work together on some of these issues, they would need to find something that they had in common. And I mean the umbrella term for progressive is, I think, just as problematic as the term liberal is. I mean, this depends on what you mean by that, and in what areas you are progressive, and but finding one group that, or sort of one goal that everyone can buy into, regardless of where they stand on other issues, and then working towards that goal, seems to be a really effective way of doing it. So, not sitting around and talking necessarily, but certainly working towards not focusing on the things that they don't have in common, but finding the one thing that they do have in common to work on. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But I'm not sure that progressive Christians are any better or worse than this than more conservative Christians. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Yeah.
All right. There's a silver lining.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think both groups can be equally. I've seen really effective partnerships in all areas of Christianity, both conservative and more progressive, especially along the lines of racial reconciliation.
Let me push on that. I'd love to hear you muse a little bit. I think one of the things, though, that progressive or liberal, however we want to categorize that whole group, sometimes we can get into kind of this oppression Olympics strategy debate. You either do it my way or the highway kind of thing. How do you navigate that? I think we during a couple weeks ago or a month ago, the whole blog lists kerfuffle was going on when Christian Piatt did the blog list and that didn't come out, and then you did one, but then you got a lot of flack because you included somebody that other folks didn't want because of other issues, and I thought you handled that really well. But how do we start to, what's the posture we need to take so that we don't get into a competition about whose strategies are better, or how do we do that debate better, or that we don't begin to compete with this issue versus this issue versus this issue, and talk about that a bit.
Yeah, there are two practices that I personally use, and that just, I think, have helped me navigate the tribalism within Christianity, that I think is what you're speaking about. And one is just like an interpretive humility. I just try really hard to think about the ways in which I participate in the body of Christ, and I use that. I think about it, and I use that metaphor a lot in my daily life. this idea that by definition I actually need other Christians who have a different perspective than me, in the same way that by definition the eye is going to have a different perspective on the world than the foot is. And so I really try to approach different perspectives with that humility, and I really do learn from people who I kind of have this spiritual discipline of listening to sermons and reading blogs by people who just strike me as wrong, and asking, being open to being taught by them. If not in the like dimension or that on the topic that I disagree with them on, but if not that topic, then in other topics. So that's one thing I personally do. And then another thing that I think is helpful is to really apply like more of a centered set perspective to the whole process of social justice in the church. The fact of the matter is like we're all going to do it differently. In some ways, I think that's strategic. I think on God's part, and just in the sense that we have a diverse body of people, and people are going to be passionate about different things, and they're going to take different approaches that work better or worse in certain situations and with certain groups of people where they're at in this moment. And I recognize that I'm not the most effective person to lead social justice in every group in the body of Christ, because I'm not that diverse and cross-cultural. And so I tend to want to work with anybody who's just moving generally in the same direction, even if the steps that they're taking are at a different pace than me, or their gait is different than mine, or their language is different than mine, or even some of their values are different than mine. So I think very broadly in terms of coalition building. If you are working for social justice and trying to be honoring, I'm happy to try to partner with you. That's sort of my stance. Because I think that the more that we nitpick about all the individual different issues, the less we're able to give people freedom to be passionate about the issues that they are passionate about, in the way that they're going about it. And I think that it's only in the context of relationship that we can even provide real pushback. I think that's one of the issues I have with the blogosphere and the Twitter sphere and all that, Twitterverse, is that what it's called, Twitterverse? All that stuff, because the people provide pushback, but it's outside the context of real relationship. And so it's like, well, before you critique somebody, maybe you should actually befriend them, get to know them, and understand where they're at, and then maybe you can offer some constructive criticism and also invite them to offer some constructive criticism based on their perspective. But just writing a blog post in protest to someone that you don't even know anyone who would even associate with them doesn't really seem helpful to me. So I don't know what you guys think about that. I know it's I know I'm a little bit strange, and listening to podcasts from people that I disagree with is an interesting exercise, and I know a lot of people think that's strange.
I was just thinking about that. I think that's a really fascinating and kind of this kind of exercise in tolerance that I like that concept. So always, at least for me, one of the greatest stressors is intolerance. I'm highly hypocritical when it comes to intolerance. I find myself unable at times to be tolerant of intolerance. But I maybe without even seeing it as a tolerance exercise, have been trying to listen more to the ethos and the energy of some of the people who either write or say things that I may not agree with. But I really love how you framed that as a personal exercise, and really kind of tolerance building and trying to find places of sameness in those people that would maybe normally be an area of friction or difference. I really love that.
Well, we tend to overestimate differences and underestimate similarities in general between ourselves and people who are different than us. And I think when we do this, first of all, I wouldn't recommend it for just across the board. And I don't think it's helpful or healthy to be in like an abusive situation. So I'm not saying that, you know, people should just indiscriminately listen to, you know, really hurtful teachings. But I do think that we can be a lot more open. I think we give people a little bit too much credit and too much power over us. And so I think, you know, I listened to one pastor in particular for about 2 years. Every single Sunday I listen to his podcast, and he's someone who's, you know, fairly difficult to listen to. And I found that I was giving him I was letting him rile me up way too much. You know, almost to a point of like, I don't know if you'd call it idolatry, but like, I'm like, why does this person have so much influence over me? It's just a person. This person's not God. It's just a person. And it was really a really good exercise for me to, I forget, I think it's like Psalm 106 or something, just like that one, like men are just grass that are going to wither away, and God is God. He's going to be here forever, you know. And I think it's helpful to even have that perspective. And then also to say, you know, I can actually learn from someone who's really different than me. There's a pastor here in the Twin Cities who's amazing. He is a mainline ELCA pastor, really progressive, neat guy, urban church. It's called Bethlehem Lutheran Church, and his church was dying in the 90s. It was kind of the typical, you know, suburban flight. Urban churches were just dying, and so their church went from like several thousand to like, you know, 500 or something like that. And they were like, we have to do something, or else we're going to be in trouble. And so this was like the early days of the purpose-driven life phenomenon extravaganza, and so he said, you know, we're going to go out to Saddleback Church, and we're going to learn on how to do church better. And he said that they sat around, and their first, like, the elders at his church were like, what can we possibly learn from a bunch of Southern Baptists in Southern California? Like, but he just said, you know, we're going to go out there and we're going to see what we can learn. And they went, and he said that halfway through the conference, they were so disgruntled, like they were just like, we disagree with theology, we disagree with like the trappings, we disagree with like so much just going on here, this is ridiculous. And then they were like, well, we actually need a lot of help, and maybe they can help. Like, maybe we should just stop being defensive, and we should lay down our Lutheran biases, and we should just listen. And so they went and they gleaned as much as they could, and they came back and they, like, you know, implemented some of those things. And I mean, numbers don't really matter, but their church has grown. But more importantly, they've planted a bunch of other churches, and they've just their ministry is flourishing in this really interesting way. And this pastor is like, you know, Rick Warren says things that make my blood boil, you know, and he says, but so did Martin Luther, and I listened to Martin Luther, you know. So I think his perspectives was encouraging and kind of interesting to me, you know, just like, you know, I'm not going to agree on a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that I can't learn from people and that other people can't learn from me. And yeah, so I don't know what you guys think about that story, but it was interesting talking to this pastor. They were the first mainline church to ever do anything with like purpose-driven church, that group. So he was a bit of a trailblazer in that sense 15 years ago. But Bruce, I see you smiling.
I was just going to say,
that could be
one
smiling
of the
about
things
10 minutes ago, I think.
Okay. He's further smiling.
I know Holly has a question from the live stream, but I want to before Holly jumps in with that question, I want to just tack on to the conversation about the blogosphere and the Twitterverse.
Yeah.
It is really interesting, and I think it's important to kind of challenge and be intentional about this in the ways that we interact. And I know Bruce talks about social media a lot too. You know, there was a TED Talk, I think, a few years ago about how Google is you know, what you search for on Google slowly gets tailored more and more to what you're searching for. And so what you actually see on the internet, it, like all the other perspectives and links to information slowly are getting filtered out, and unless you're intentional about going and seeking out other voices, other perspectives, you know, the internet is intentionally working against that. And so, and if you're not, Facebook friends with people who have other views than you, then you're not going to see it in your news feed, and you're not going to be challenged by it. But I appreciate that you did add that qualification, because I know a lot of, particularly my LGBT friends who, they've heard so much oppressive stuff for so long, that it's not safe, and so it's just not a good idea to, immerse themselves back into that world. So I appreciate that caveat that you put on there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly listen to people who have said racist things and have said sexist things, and that's hard, it's like, it's like being part of a family. Sometimes it's really hard, so we do have to be wise, for sure.
Occasionally, crazy uncle says something really awful.
Yeah, or sometimes he's not even perceived as crazy, which, yeah, it's even harder.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Emily,
I mean, sometimes he's normalized. But go ahead.
Emily or Teresa, did you guys have something to respond to Christena directly before I go into some questions from the chat?
I was just going to add the component of, sometimes the things that we're critiquing about people, they're, for example, racism. Those are systemic issues in our society, and they're things that, are learned and structures that we, intentionally or unintentionally participate in. And so I think sometimes it's helpful to not view those critiques as personally as sometimes they can come across as. And it's hard. I think there's an art and a skill to that. But I think it's also important for us to note how our society is shaping our conversations, how it's shaping our actions, and our relationships with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right on. Well, I have some folks who are chatting with us, and I've got a question from Josie Speak. He says, is the whole, quote, drawing lines along race/culture, quote, a generational thing? Sometimes that is prevalent among baby boomers or Gen Xers. As a 20-something, perhaps my biases are more subtle. So he's asking about a generational difference in the way we perceive differences.
Mm.
I'll take a quick stab. I've heard, I think there was a time where well-intentioned parents taught their children not to see color, and in the attempt that we don't treat each other differently based on that. And then there's been a shift to, wait a minute, now we want to see color, not so that it confines our behavior, but so that we experience the expansiveness of God's creation. And that language and then how we do that is this. I think that's a generational shift. I don't think racism has changed all that much, maybe in its manifestations. And so now we're trying to figure out what's the vernacular and the language that we need to use in order to talk about race, and the negative and kind of destructive elements of racism that exist within a generation that's coming into power and is influencing structures and society. So I think that is the shift. Not that it's changed, but it manifests itself differently, and we're now being given different language to talk about it that I'm not sure we're fully equipped to handle.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any. I mean, I'm not sure what ethnicity that that respondent was, but I haven't seen any generational differences between people who are ethnic minorities in the United States across generational lines. So Asian Americans still identify just as strongly as Asian American as they did last generation. Same thing with African American, Latino, and Hispanic. So it seems that we still perceive the cultural lines, at least from the perspective of people of color.
So we have another question from a couple different people, actually. The questions come up. How do, it came from one person as how do I, as a non-Christian, work with Christians better? And then we had, I believe, a Christian say, how do we Christians work with non-Christians better?
Do you want me to take a stab at that? So, I mean, the same approach that I would take for like a Calvinist and an Arminian is the same approach that I would take for someone who's trying to connect across Christian versus non-Christian lines. And again, I would appeal to superordinate identity. So in this case, the larger identity that brings us together is that we're human. And so that can be one thing. So looking for similarities along those lines, which is what I would say to the Calvinist and the Arminian, to appeal to a higher identity.
Yeah. I guess for me, I wonder, is it ever okay in a process to say, great, I see we have a difference here, let's back up that difference and go back to what we agree about? Like, is it okay to just say, great, we have a difference here, let's not make that matter? Can we just, we acknowledge a difference and then set it aside?
I think it depends on the difference. And I think it depends on if there's a power difference between the two people, because not all differences are created equal. So if I'm talking with somebody who prefers like one interpretation of Scripture over another, or for example, like prefers one atonement metaphor over another, and it doesn't really have implications for how for like our status or our power, then I would say let's just like agree to disagree or something like that. But when there are differences along lines that have status differences associated with them, then I think that the person who has more power needs to acquiesce to the person who has less power, because for them it does matter. You can't just gloss over it. So if a white person says to me, let's just not talk anymore about racial differences, then I would just say, you don't really want to be my friend if that's the case, because for me this is a difference that I can't ignore, and it means it has implications for my life in ways that it doesn't have implications for your own life. So I think it depends on the difference.
Well,
I don't know
I would just, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask Emily and Teresa if you guys had any thoughts on that.
For what you just said, brought me back to the previous question as well, that idea of privilege that we see and privilege that we maybe don't see in this generation or this era, that identity of race or along racial lines, when it comes from somebody maybe that's been raised in a culture that we've kind of diminished maybe the most isolating and abusive terms, but comes from a place of white privilege, they may not see that distinguished difference, you know, and I think you said, Christina, that if you're from a minority culture, that you have, you know, that identity hasn't necessarily changed, but I would say also some of those, I mean, I know just in the experience of my own lifetime, I've had plenty of racial-related vitriol in my direction that don't sound very different from the generations that came before me of people of color and of different minorities. So that, in terms of this dialogue, makes me think that, yeah, there's a value to power in those conversations that has to be acknowledged. And I think sometimes maybe when we try and make everybody equal in a setting, we're not taking into account the fact that there really is an inequality that still exists in society. We have to reflect that in the room. We have to acknowledge that in that relationship with that other person. or like you said, it's not really an authentic friendship. It's just a friendship that makes me feel better about feeling, that I've changed my feelings about you as a person, but it doesn't change the dynamics of the world around us.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it has to be a mutual decision. For both people would have to say, yes, this is something we're going to set aside. But that said, I wouldn't recommend that people devote a lot of time, especially first off, to talking about their difference. I remember right after the Trayvon Martin verdict came out, I got tons of emails from people who were like, I really want to do something to build racial unity in my neighborhood. I'm thinking about, and I literally got like 12 emails with this same idea. Like, I'm thinking about hosting a dinner party and getting a bunch of white people and black people together to talk about the issues. And I was like, don't do that. That's a really bad idea. Someone might get hurt, And so actually all the research would suggest that if there are people who don't agree on something that's really important, like an issue like this one, or LGBTQ issues, or just, any major division where there just is sort of like a standoff, then the suggestion is to find something else that you all have in common and work towards that. So you're not having conversations, you're actually just like doing a project together. And in the context of that project, you actually get to know each other. People become personalized. They're not just a nameless, faceless person of a group who just agrees with you. They actually have their own stories and their own background. And you're actually setting that issue aside so that you can build trust and you can build some buy-in, and then you can return to those issues later on. And so, this takes time. This isn't rocket science, but at the same time, it's costly because you have to be willing to invest time. It's not going to happen over one dinner conversation. But those, that approach has been incredibly effective, like in Northern Ireland. Between Protestants and Catholics in South Africa, between white South Africans and black South Africans. So there's lots of space for people to begin to come together by momentarily setting aside their differences. But then you have to return to them for sure.
I've got another question.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go, and then I'll do a chat question.
I was just going to say, I think those are, I definitely agree. But sometimes I think it's also valuable to sit and listen and learn more about the differences themselves. And because I think sometimes we're so quick to find things that we're alike about that we can drown out the differences and really just kind of minimize those experiences and just those realities that we just don't know or don't understand. And so taking time to intentionally listen and maybe not really doing much or feeling like we have much of a shared identity, but just listening. It could be hard work, but I think it's okay.
I think that's so important. I think that's especially important for people who are part of the dominant group or people in power to listen. I think that's really hard. That's hard for people to do, but I think it's a good goal. So if someone wanted to host a dinner party and just let people from the dominant white majority listen to black perspectives, I think that could be something that's very healing. I know here in the Twin Cities we had a forum that was essentially that. A lot of people coming together to hear black perspectives on the verdict, and it wasn't a discussion. It was really just a time for listening, and I think that was really healing. So you're right. There's a space for that.
Awesome.
Well, and I think we're so eager to have it fixed tomorrow. I think we want. And that we want to be that dinner party idea is, well, if we do this, then the next time we get together, it'll all be fine. And the listening piece is, I hear your pain, but and so I think you're right. I think the ability to step back and not respond is really hard. I think for men, when women are sharing pain, for us not to say, not all men are like that, or to not have to respond to that. for every dominant group is really, really hard because it becomes personal to us, and it means that we have to change, and we don't want to.
Mm-hmm. Who just said that, Bruce?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks. I wasn't sure if it was you or Steve who just said that. Cool. Yeah, I agree. It is. I think it's really hard for people to just listen, especially on a topic that's so vitriolic. So sometimes it is helpful to do something else.
So I'd love to bring in a question from the chat on YouTube. We have with us on the chat Morgan Guyton, and he asks, I think he's referring to your book, do you deal with the way in which allies tend to try to out-ally each other as a power play?
I do not deal with that in my book, no. That's the short answer.
Sorry, Morgan.
Yeah. I mean, the book doesn't really go in that direction, but it's an interesting idea. What do you guys think about that? I mean, I read a lot about allies, but
I personally believe that ally is...
I've always had a very difficult time with the word
ally. Yeah.
I view ally as something that people live out and not a label to just kind of take for yourself. So that's my personal belief.
Yeah, Black Girl Dangerous wrote a piece last week about how, like, you know, they're advocating getting rid of the term ally forever. And if you're going to use a label at all, the label should be, I'm currently operating in solidarity with you, which basically says, like, I don't get any credit for what I have done in the past, and I don't get any credit for what I intend to do. All that's happening is what I'm doing right now. Like, that's what I'm doing. But you're right that the term is really problematic. There's in some circles, there's a weird way that you can get more power by claiming to be an ally, when really it should be subverted. Allies should be, like, seen but not heard, I think, but that's often not the case.
Christina, could you say more about that, being seen but not heard?
Well, it just, to me, if the whole point of being an ally is to empower, is to redistribute power, to address societal issues in a way that's empowering to the people who have been disempowered. And so to the extent that you're an ally, other people's voices should be rising above yours. If you're an effective ally, then you should be become less and less prominent in all the ways that we define prominence in our society. And so, the way I see it is, like, I mean, a great example would be my pastor, actually. One of my pastors. One of my pastors is a white male, and he has a fair amount of clout in our denomination. He's on the national board, etc. And I would define him as someone who's an ally or someone who's currently standing in solidarity with me. And one of the ways that he does this is by, like, at national board meetings, making sure that women and people of color are speaking at the conferences. And that means that he's not speaking at the conferences. He's not speaking at the conferences on how he's an ally towards people of color. He's not even on the stage, so that people like me and other women of color can be on the stage. And so in some ways it almost looks like he's losing clout or losing power in the denomination. And actually I think he is in that respect. So that's different than what most people do with the question, I think, that Morgan asked of out-allying other allies.
That's
great. Yeah, thanks for that. So I have another question. This is from Yaz A. And first thing she wants to give us is the construction of race, and she's defining it as an illusion, as a competent biologist would state, serves as a justification for prejudices rooted in trauma, greed, low self-esteem, and or low self-image. And question 1 she has is, do you believe the usual conversation on race continues to facilitate society's conditioning in delivering preferential treatments to others for any other reason? For any reason. So do you believe that
I don't think I heard all of that.
So she's asking.
Holly, do you mind just repeating the question?
Sure. Yeah, it sounds like she's asking, do you believe the usual conversation on race continues to facilitate society's conditioning in delivering preferential treatments to others for any reason?
Just the conversation on race?
Yeah. And I'll give you her question, her second question, her follow-up is, do you believe that it's time to start a national dialogue? Do you believe it's time to start a national dialogue on deconstructing the construction of race from a historical, aesthetic, emotional, psychological, and economic lens?
I think there's already been a national dialogue on that going on, certainly within the people of color community. So I think people are certainly welcome to join into that. I'm not sure that simply talking about race perpetuates racial inequality. Is that the question that's being asked? Is that essentially it? That simply talking about race sort of maintains the construct of race, which maintains inequality, racial inequality? Is that the...
Possibly. I mean, I'm just going off of her.
Okay.
For you, yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't think so. I think that in order to even begin to deconstruct race, we would have to talk broadly and extensively about what race means in our society right now. And so those conversations, I think, are actually, the conversations that we have on race tend to lead to more equality as the inequalities are brought to people's attention. But I guess I'm not sure that I completely understand the question, unfortunately. Does anyone else have any insights or that?
Well, I mean, I was just thinking it sounds like the difference between dialoguing about race in terms of creating or solidifying the difference versus talking about race to find places of equality, find places of sameness. So I think, at least for me, from actually I met with Yaz just a few days ago, so I know who she is. And we spoke about her mother's an anthropologist, and so she spent a lot of time with in conversation around the idea of race as being, genetically. There's such a minute difference between all of us, down to the genetic fibers of who we are, and sort of from that idea, how do we deconstruct all these kind of walls that we've put up between each other that have sort of solidified our difference from one another, each person group. My person group is this and that. And at least for me, I see it's the difference between this sort of unhealthy identity that can create walls versus maybe cultural differences where we can appreciate the differences of each person rather than creating a lesser, greater than kind of dichotomy.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful.
I think conversation that leads to kind of evaluation and action to try to dismantle some of these systemic issues, like white supremacy and the various forms that presents itself in our society, and historical, many of the historical disadvantages that that's given people of color in the various ways, and the advantages that that's given white folks. I think conversation that leads to action on those fronts is beneficial. I do respect the fact that I know many people of color that they get tired of just talking about stuff for the sake of talking about stuff. And so I think we have to be mindful about, you know, what is our end game? Is our end game to really get to know these people, build relationship with the end goal of trying to bring healing and shalom in our community, in our churches, in our world.
Yeah. I also think that, you know, there's a, if for good reason, and I completely understand this, I think that a lot of the conversations that, a lot of the conversational style and the approach that people within the Christian faith have taken to addressing social justice issues have been off-putting to a lot of people. I run into people all the time who like say, I tried to have a conversation on racial justice when I went to my Christian college and I just went away feeling bashed. And I think there's really a fine line between like coddling the privileged people and you know, being an effective communicator, and I think it's, you know, it's a gray area, so it's hard to do that. But at the same time, I do think that the approach that we take can be life-giving, or it can be kind of disillusioning, just even in how we frame the problems and the spirit with which we bring it. And I think there can be a lot of dishonoring conversations to both privileged people and also to people from traditionally oppressed groups if we're not careful. And so certainly, as this question might be kind of hinting at that too, I think that the way that we go about having these conversations is so important. There just needs to be a lot of grace all around. And it's hard to do that when you're coming from a place of like, you know, defensiveness or pain or very legitimate places, in my opinion. Yeah.
That's kind of brings me to another question from Yaz. Third question. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, good. How do we bring God's wise order into the world if we don't challenge ourselves to think about nativism, ego, pride, low self-esteem, image, and identity? And then she has in parentheses, Christ-less versus Christ-centered. So how do we bring God's wise order into the world if we don't challenge ourselves to think about nativism, ego, pride, low self-esteem, image, and identity?
Can you read the list again? Pride, what?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. She said, thinking about nativism, ego, pride, low self-esteem / image, and identity. You know?
Okay.
And I just want to speak to this. I think, yes, I think that we have to talk about nativism and the level of consciousness that we're at, you know, the level of consciousness that we're dealing with. I think ego is a huge part of it. I think ego loves power, and just like how we can be, you know, our ego can be fed by just the act of being an ally, you know. I think that self-image and low self-esteem totally go into how we interact with these forces of isms in the world, and what we do with them when we encounter them, whether we internalize them, whether we use them to our own devices, our own advantage. You know, that would just be I think Yaz is really on to something there. I feel like those pieces are so huge to addressing the systemic, the personal, connecting our personal stories with the systemic issues, those problems that exist in mass, I think is really huge. Teresa, you don't want to talk about ego right now. You don't want to talk about contemplative practice and how good it is for you. Nothing?
You want me to go into ego? Well.
Teresa, could you talk about ego?
If we have a whole another hour. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, I think part of that maybe just layers in with my area of understanding, which is the person in the system. So rather than from the therapeutic and the trauma perspective, oftentimes I start from the person out. Each person in that system, and the layers of woundedness and healing that has to be done. And I think the addiction recovery world has a great sort of name for the way that these two sides we all encounter in ourselves, and they call it the king baby. So we're always kind of, our ego is struggling between these two places of, being the king and understanding everything the best, and the baby who is just feeling that they're weak and neurotic, and I'm not sure if anything about me is good. And I feel like that our personal ego kind of struggles between those two places, and that gets mixed all into the work we're doing and how we're doing it and how we see ourselves and how we see everyone else in that process.
Yeah, I mean, those issues are so central to certainly the way that we interact with people who are different than us. And I know I talk a lot about identity and self-esteem in my book, and ego kind of plays into that. And something I ask myself all the time as a reconciler is, on my best day, where does my identity lie? And on my worst day, where does my identity lie? Because that certainly affects the way that I perceive other groups, and even the amount of grace that I have for other groups. And so I like the way that Yaz couched it, just sort of in this umbrella of being part of this created order, and the brokenness or fallenness or dysfunction in our own individual sense of self that contributes to the systemic dysfunction, and that sort of relationship, navigating that, I think it's important to reflect on that as reconcilers.
Well, I want to be mindful of our time, and I guess ask. I think I have one more question for Christena, but if others have any other comments or questions they want to make before we wrap up. Otherwise, I'll share my question. I'm curious, Christena, with the work that you do, going in, working with churches, and sort of your perspective on the landscape, just your experience, your experience of the churches that you've worked with. Is this disunity, is this fragmentation, is it getting worse, or is it getting better? Are you optimistic? Are you hopeful? Or kind of what are you feeling about the state of things?
I'm incredibly hopeful. I'm not sure that it's gotten any worse. I just think that more people have mouthpieces that go further now. So I think that the comments that people used to make over a dinner table or whispering to their friends are now tweeted and blogged about. And so everything's kind of on blast in a way that I think is unhelpful. But at least I think people are now starting to realize, like, oh, wow, we have a problem. This is obvious, and I think the problem was more hidden before. And so one of the things that I think is the most encouraging about my work with churches is the wide diversity of churches that I work with. really almost every theological stream, almost every ethnic group, almost every class, economic group is diving into this issue like pretty headfirst, and I think that's really encouraging. It's not just the progressives, it's not just the conservatives, it's not just the black people. And so to see, I mean, I feel like my job is incredibly hopeful because I get to go all over the country and meet pockets of people who are very much on the ground working towards these issues and making a difference in these areas and letting go of privilege or taking risks in ways that they hadn't before. And it's cool. I get to see that, and it's encouraging to me. And I think that oftentimes if you're just in your own little area, it can feel like it's you against the whole world. And that's certainly not the case, which is why I really want people to get out of their tribalism so that they can actually see that there are other people who are doing this, I get to see all that because I am cross-tribal. But I think people would be encouraged to hear that there are people that they perceive as really different than them who care very much about some of the same issues that they care about. So I'm encouraged.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate being on this. It was fun, and it was great to meet all of you, too, Teresa and Emily and Holly. I don't think I've met you, so it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
Thanks.
Well, it's...
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, and we're going to keep doing this, and I hope folks will like the Facebook page for Sogo Media and keep up to date, because we plan to have more of these conversations. Obviously, we talked, again tonight, and about moving beyond just talking about things to action, and that's what we want to be about. But there's a really important place for conversations like this, and really grateful for everybody here and all the important work that y'all are doing. And your willingness to come on and share your perspectives on this, so that we can move now towards greater unity and collaboration, and to see good and positive things come from the work that we're doing. So, does anyone have a closing word or benediction or prayer that they want to share?
I just wanted to ask Christena, I know your book, Disunity in Christ, is coming out soon. Can you tell us the release date on that?
Yes, it's November 4th.
Yay. Well, congratulations on that, and we wish you the best of
Thank
luck.
you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well,
And
go ahead, Holly.
And I also just wanted to say thank you to you all from our chat participants on YouTube, and also a big thank you to everyone on YouTube for participating and being a part of this conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll just wrap things up with a fairly traditional benediction and say, "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord."
Thank you, God.
Good night.
Amen.
Good night.
Right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.